The Siege of Leningrad, one of the most tragic chapters of World War II, lasted 872 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944. The siege was a result of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, which began on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in history in terms of manpower and casualties. Hitler's forces, breaking a non-aggression pact with Stalin, launched a surprise attack that brought 3.8 million Axis soldiers across a 3,000-kilometer front. The invasion was supported by a huge number of vehicles and horses, with the goal of crushing Soviet forces and capturing key territories, including the vital city of Leningrad. As the German army advanced, they were followed by Einsatzgruppen. These were special squads tasked with murdering civilians, particularly Jews, communists, and those suspected of being partisans. These units committed horrific atrocities, often forcing their victims to dig their own graves before shooting them. The brutality of their actions was staggering, with entire villages wiped out and millions of Soviet prisoners of war and civilians perishing from executions, forced labor, starvation, and systematic abuse. The Siege of Leningrad was one of the most intense and heartbreaking parts of the Eastern Front. The city was completely isolated from the outside world, cut off from essential supplies like food and fuel. The Germans, along with their Finnish allies, surrounded the city, and their plan was to starve it into submission. They blockaded all roads and railways leading into Leningrad, preventing any supplies from reaching the trapped civilians. For the 2.5 million people who were inside the city at the start of the siege, survival became an almost impossible struggle. Food quickly ran out, and rationing began, with the daily bread ration dropping to a mere 125 grams, which is only about 2 slices of bread. The bread itself was often made from a mix of sawdust and other inedible fillers. People resorted to desperate measures just to stay alive. Starvation became very common. People were forced to eat anything they could find, from leather belts, wallpaper paste, and even pets. There were over 2,000 arrests for cannibalism during the siege, as some people, driven mad by hunger, turned to eating human flesh. The death toll from starvation alone was huge, with as many as 1 million people dying from hunger, exposure, and constant German bombardment. On top of that, the harsh winters made survival even more difficult. With no fuel, the city's residents were unable to heat their homes, and the freezing temperatures killed many more. Water became scarce as pipes froze, forcing people to trek to the frozen Neva River to collect water. German artillery bombarded the city regularly, adding to the misery as buildings crumbled and lives were lost in the attacks. Despite the extreme conditions, the citizens of Leningrad showed remarkable resilience. Some even continued to work in factories, producing weapons for the Soviet war effort, though they were starving and freezing. Art and culture also played a role in keeping hope alive. One famous example is the performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which was performed by a group of musicians who were themselves starving. The concert was broadcast throughout the city, becoming a powerful symbol of defiance and survival. Throughout the siege, the Soviet government made attempts to get supplies to the city. The most famous of these efforts was the Road of Life, a supply route across the frozen Lake Ladoga. In the winter months, trucks navigated the dangerous ice, bringing limited amounts of food and fuel into the city. However, the journey was dangerous, as German planes often bombed the convoys, and the ice could break at any moment, sending the trucks and their cargo plunging into the freezing water. Finally, after nearly 2.5 years of suffering, the Soviet forces managed to break the blockade in January 1944. The siege was lifted, but the damage it did was huge. An estimated 1.5 million people died, many of them civilians. The city was left in ruins, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Chapter 2. The Fall of a Tyrant. Major General Heinrich Remlinger and the Atrocities of Pskov. Major General Heinrich Remlinger was one of the highest-ranking German officers tried for war crimes after World War II. His trial attracted significant attention, both because of his rank and the severity and brutality of the crimes he was accused of committing. Remlinger commanded multiple operations in the Pskov region, where his troops carried out a systematic campaign of terror against civilians. The charges against him were severe, orchestrating the burning of entire villages and the mass murder of approximately 8,000 civilians, most of whom were women and children. The evidence presented at his trial included both recovered documents and the powerful testimonies of witnesses who had survived the atrocities. The trial took place in a courtroom full of military officials, journalists, and members of the public eager for justice. The atmosphere was tense as people awaited to hear the full extent of Remlinger's crimes. As the proceedings began, the prosecution laid out a detailed account of Remlinger's actions. Witnesses recounted horrific scenes, families dragged from their homes and executed, villages set aflame with people still inside, and fields littered with bodies. One particularly terrifying testimony came from a survivor who described how Remlinger's troops forced civilians into a barn, locked the doors, and then set it on fire. The air in the courtroom was heavy, as the survivor recalled the screams and the smell of burning flesh, leaving many in the room in tears. The defense tried to argue that Remlinger was simply following orders, a common claim made by many military officers tried for war crimes. However, the evidence of his direct involvement and the clear enjoyment he seemed to take in the power he wielded weakened this defense. Documents signed by Remlinger ordering mass executions and property destruction were presented, alongside orders he gave for severe measures to be taken against the civilian population. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Remlinger had played a major role in some of the most horrifying acts of the war. The result of the trial came when Remlinger was given a chance to speak. His statement was brief, with no sign of any remorse. He claimed he had served his country as any soldier would and argued that the real crimes were against the German people. His lack of empathy and refusal to acknowledge the suffering he caused only solidified the case against him. After days of testimony and deliberation, the judges delivered their verdict. Remlinger was found guilty on all counts and given the sentence of death by hanging. His execution was scheduled shortly after the trial, carried out in the same square in Leningrad where his crimes had been some of the most brutal. In his final statement, Karl showed a brief moment of what seemed like regret, claiming that the war had changed him and that he was a different person before the conflict. Yet, this did little to change the judges or the public's opinion of him. The judges found Captain Strufing Karl guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging. His execution was carried out swiftly, marking the end of a dark chapter for the victims and survivors of his ruthless campaign. Chapter 3. The Flames of Destruction, Oberfeldwebel Engel Fritz and the Burning of 7 Villages. Oberfeldwebel Engel Fritz was brought to trial for his severe war crimes committed during World War II, particularly focusing on his role in the destruction of 7 villages and the killing of numerous civilians. The trial began with the prosecution presenting overwhelming evidence against Fritz, including written orders he had issued to his unit, which explicitly directed the destruction and detailed the methods to be used against civilian targets. The courtroom heard how Fritz had personally overseen the operations, ensuring that his orders were executed with lethal precision. Witnesses, including survivors from the destroyed villages, provided tragic testimonies. One elderly woman described how Fritz's unit arrived at dawn, forcibly gathered the villagers, and then set the entire village on fire. She spoke of the helplessness and horror as they watched everything they owned turn to ash. Another testimony came from a man who was a boy at the time. He recounted hiding in a nearby forest, witnessing Fritz laughing as the village burned. Photographic evidence displayed the aftermath of the burned villages, showing the extent of the destruction and the personal tragedies of those who lost their lives. The defense attempted to mitigate Fritz's role by claiming he was merely following military orders. Fritz himself maintained that he was a soldier executing commands and argued that his actions were aligned with military objectives. However, this defense was effectively discarded by the prosecution through cross-examination. They emphasized on his proactive role and his documented enthusiasm for the tasks, which went beyond mere obedience and demonstrated a clear intent to cause suffering. Prosecutors used Fritz's own orders and the testimony of eyewitnesses who described his demeanor and actions during the attacks to challenge his claims of compulsion. They argued that his conduct exhibited both compliance and an eagerness and satisfaction in the cruelty inflicted upon civilians. After extensive deliberations, the judges delivered their verdict. Fritz was found guilty on multiple counts of war crimes, including the willful killing of civilians and the destruction of property. The sentence was death by hanging. Chapter 4. The Executioner's Duty, Ernst Bohm, and the Destruction of Soviet Villages. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Bohm was born in Germany in 1912 and joined the German army at a young age, fully accepting the Nazi regime's ideology. By the time World War II broke out, Bohm had risen through the ranks, becoming an important figure in the Nazi war machine. He was deeply loyal to Adolf Hitler's vision of conquest and played a significant role in the military operations on the Eastern Front, particularly in the destruction of Soviet villages and the massacre of civilians. Bohm's trial was focused on the atrocities he committed during Nazi operations in the Soviet Union. He was charged with overseeing the destruction of several villages, including Krivets and Olkovka, where his unit slaughtered around 60 civilians. These crimes were part of the larger Nazi strategy to eliminate resistance and terrorize local populations. The evidence presented at the trial included documents signed by Bohm, showing that he had personally ordered the burning of villages and the execution of civilians. However, his role was not limited to giving orders. Witnesses testified that Bohm had also actively participated in the killings, including the execution of 6 civilians. One document showed that Bohm had instructed his men to leave no survivors, making it clear that the goal was to wipe out entire villages. Bohm's contributions to the Nazi regime extended beyond these specific actions. As an officer, he was responsible for enforcing Nazi ideology on the battlefield, ensuring that his men followed the brutal policies set by the Nazi High Command. His willingness to carry out these orders without hesitation made him a valuable asset to the regime. His actions contributed to the terror that the Nazi army spread across Eastern Europe, where millions of civilians were killed or displaced as part of Hitler's campaign for dominance. At the trial, Bohm argued that he had no choice but to carry out the brutal actions he was accused of. However, the prosecution countered this by presenting overwhelming evidence of his direct involvement in the atrocities. A former soldier from Bohm's unit also testified, describing how Bohm had calmly given the orders to execute civilians and burn their homes. This testimony, along with the evidence presented, left no doubt that Bohm had played an active and willing role in the massacres. Bohm was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. Chapter 5. The Trenches of Death. Edward Sonnenfeld and the Massacres in Zapolia and Seglitzy. Lieutenant Eduard Sonnenfeld was born in 1910 in Germany and became an early supporter of the Nazi regime, deeply influenced by its aggressive ideology. He joined the German army and worked his way up the ranks, eventually becoming an important commander by the time World War II began. Sonnenfeld was particularly active on the Eastern Front, where he played a major role in carrying out brutal operations against Soviet civilians. His contributions to the Nazi war effort were focused on enforcing Nazi policies of terror, which included mass killings and the destruction of villages. Sonnenfeld's trial revolved around his direct involvement in a series of massacres and village burnings during the final years of the war. One of the most horrific incidents took place in Zapolia, where Sonnenfeld led his men in killing 40 civilians. Another atrocity occurred in the village of Seglitzy, where Sonnenfeld's unit forced villagers to dig trenches. Once the trenches were dug, they were used as mass graves. Sonnenfeld personally ordered the villagers into the trenches and then had his men throw grenades at them, killing everyone inside. Witnesses from the trial testified that Sonnenfeld was present during these events, and in many cases he personally participated in the killings. Sonnenfeld's trial presented detailed evidence of his role in these atrocities. Documents and orders with his signature were presented in court, showing that he had directed his unit to carry out these brutal acts. Survivors of the villages testified against Sonnenfeld, recounting the horrors they witnessed under his command. One survivor described the massacre in Seglitzy, detailing how the villagers, including women and children, were locked in trenches and slaughtered. The court found Lieutenant Eduard Sonnenfeld guilty of war crimes, including the mass murder of civilians and the destruction of villages. His contributions to the Nazi regime were undeniable. He had been an active participant in carrying out its most brutal policies on the Eastern Front. His conviction and subsequent death sentence by hanging were seen as a small measure of justice for the countless lives he destroyed. Chapter 6. The Flames of Malyaluzy. Janica Gergard and the Massacre of Innocents. Janica Gergard, born in 1915 in Germany, was a soldier who played an important role in the Nazi regime's terror on the Eastern Front during World War II. Although he did not hold a high rank, his actions left a lasting impact on the civilians in the Soviet Union. He was involved in multiple atrocities, including mass killings and the burning of villages. Gergard was known for his loyalty to the Nazi regime and his willingness to carry out even the most brutal orders. Gergard's trial focused on one of the most horrific incidents he was involved in, the massacre at the village of Malye-Luzy. On the orders of his superiors, Gergard led a group of soldiers to the village, where they rounded up 88 civilians, most of them women and children. The civilians were forced into a barn, which was then set on fire. The court heard testimony from survivors who described the screams coming from inside the barn as the victims were burned alive. Gergard was directly linked to the planning and execution of this massacre. The prosecution presented documents and witness testimonies that proved Gergard's involvement in this atrocity. Witnesses testified that Gergard did not hesitate to carry out these orders and seemed to take pride in the destruction he caused. One survivor testified that Gergard had personally shot several villagers who tried to escape the fire, ensuring that no one survived. Gergard was also accused of participating in other village burnings and mass executions. The court heard how he was involved in the slaughter of more than 300 civilians throughout his time on the Eastern Front. His actions contributed significantly to the terror that Nazi forces unleashed on Soviet civilians. The court found Janica Gergard guilty of war crimes, including the murder of civilians and the burning of villages. His role in the Nazi regime's atrocities, though that of a soldier, was no less significant than those of higher-ranking officers. His sentence was death by hanging, a punishment for the severity of his crimes. Chapter 7. The Flames of War, Erwin Ernst's Role in the Destruction of Soviet Villages. Erwin Ernst was born in 1913 in Germany. Although a lower-ranking soldier, Ernst's actions contributed to the widespread terror inflicted on Soviet civilians. His trial focused on his direct involvement in mass killings and the destruction of villages, where hundreds of civilians, mostly women and children, were brutally murdered. The main charges against Ernst included the burning of several villages and the murder of approximately 100 civilians. In one of the most horrific incidents, Ernst and his unit trapped civilians inside their homes and set the buildings on fire. Survivors testified how the flames consumed the village, and anyone trying to escape was shot on sight. Multiple witnesses described Ernst's role in overseeing the operation, ensuring that no one survived. He was personally responsible for shooting several civilians who attempted to flee the burning buildings. The court presented evidence of Ernst's direct participation in these crimes, including signed orders and detailed accounts from survivors. Ernst's loyalty to the Nazi regime and his willingness to carry out its brutal policies were evident throughout the trial. His actions were part of a broader Nazi strategy aimed at clearing Soviet territories of civilians. Erwin Ernst was found guilty of war crimes and was sentenced to death by hanging for his crimes. Chapter 8. Justice in the Cold. The public execution of 8 German soldiers in Leningrad. Finally, on January 5, 1946, Leningrad witnessed the execution day. In a public square near a local market, surrounded by the ruins of buildings that had been bombed during the war, a large gallows had been built. This was the place chosen for the execution of 8 German soldiers, responsible for countless atrocities during the invasion of the Soviet Union, including the horrific Siege of Leningrad. That January day was bitterly cold, and thousands of people had gathered in the square to witness the event. Many were survivors of the 872-day siege. For them, these 8 men represented the very worst of the enemy, the soldiers who had caused so much pain and loss. The gallows, built specifically for this execution, stood tall in the middle of the square. It was a simple but imposing structure, with 8 nooses hanging from the beams. The atmosphere in the crowd was tense. People watched in silence as the prisoners were led to the gallows, each one wearing the expression of a man who knew his fate was sealed. The 8 men, once powerful soldiers in the Nazi army, now stood as criminals, stripped of their rank and authority. They had been sentenced to death after being found guilty of some of the worst crimes committed during the war. Their trial had been quick, the evidence overwhelming, The Soviet authorities had left no room for doubt, and now the final part of their punishment was about to be carried out. As they were brought to the gallows, the crowd remained silent. There was no shouting, no cheers, just a heavy, silent feeling. Many in the crowd had lost family members, friends, and neighbors during the war, and the sight of these men about to be executed was a small piece of justice for the unimaginable suffering they had endured. One by one, the men were placed under the nooses. Some stood calmly, accepting their fate, while others appeared nervous, their eyes glancing around the crowd as if searching for a way out. But there was no escape. The executioner performed his duty methodically, and as the platforms beneath the men were removed, they were left hanging in the cold winter air. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd watched as the bodies swung from the ropes, but there was no celebration. For the people of Leningrad, this moment was not about revenge, but about closure. These men had been part of a machine that had inflicted untold pain and suffering on their city, and now they had faced justice. The Soviet press covered the event extensively, emphasizing the importance of justice for war crimes. While the hangings were meant to punish these men, this also sent a very important message to the world. The executions were meant to show that the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime would not be forgotten, and those responsible would face the ultimate punishment. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, there was no sense of victory or joy. The people of Leningrad were still mourning their own losses, still recovering from the horrors of the siege. The execution of these 8 men did not bring back the lives that had been lost or heal the deep scars left by the war. But it did offer a small sense of justice, a recognition that the suffering of the people had not gone unanswered. For the survivors of Leningrad, the public execution of these war criminals was a step toward moving on from the past. Chapter 9: Shadows of Kiev, The Road to Justice. After Nazi occupation. While Leningrad faced starvation and relentless attacks, Kiev witnessed a different kind of horror. The city, captured by Nazi forces in 1941, became the site of one of the most horrific massacres of World War II. In the aftermath of the war, much like in Leningrad, the Soviet authorities sought justice for the war crimes committed in Kiev. These efforts were marked by the Kiev trials, where Nazi officers and collaborators stood trial for their actions during the occupation. Central to these trials was the investigation into one of the darkest events in the city's history, the Babin Yar massacre. Kiev, like many other Soviet cities, fell to the advancing German forces during Operation Barbarossa. What followed was a brutal occupation, where Nazi policies were enforced with terrifying speed and cruelty. Chapter 10: Contextual Background, Anti-Semitism and the Capture of Kiev. Before World War II, anti-Semitism was already deeply rooted in Kiev. For centuries, Jewish communities faced harsh treatment, including violent attacks, looting, and even killings. In the 19th century, these events were common, and the Jewish population often found itself blamed for various problems. When the Russian Empire fell and the Russian Civil War erupted between 1919 and 1923, things got even worse for Jews in Ukraine. They became scapegoats during the chaos, and both the White Army and Ukrainian nationalist groups targeted them, leading to more violence and death. Things did not improve much when the Soviet Union was established. Under Joseph Stalin, Jewish people were often portrayed as enemies of the state. During the Holodomor, the famine that struck Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, Jews were blamed for the widespread starvation, despite the fact that the famine was a direct result of Stalin's policies. The government used propaganda to accuse Jews of being part of conspiracies and plots, stirring up even more resentment toward them. As the years passed, tensions only grew worse. By the time World War II began, many Ukrainians harbored deep-seated distrust and hatred toward their Jewish neighbors. They were seen as responsible for many of the country's troubles, including the economic hardships and political instability that had plagued Ukraine for decades. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, their invasion of the Soviet Union. This invasion was the largest military operation in history, involving millions of Axis soldiers pushing across a vast front. Hitler's forces aimed to crush the Soviet Union and take control of key cities, including Kiev. Kiev was a major target for the Germans because of its strategic importance. On September 19, 1941, after intense fighting, the German army captured the city. The Red Army had fought hard but was eventually forced to retreat, leaving Kiev to the mercy of the Nazis. For the people of Kiev, especially the Jewish population, the capture of the city marked the beginning of a terrifying new reality. Once the Germans took control, they wasted no time in establishing their rule. Kiev became part of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, a German-controlled region. Under the Nazis, life became extremely difficult for the Jewish population. The Germans, with the help of local collaborators, quickly began targeting Jews. They were subjected to public humiliation, forced to wear identifying badges, and stripped of their rights. Jews were also forced to do hard labor for the occupying forces, often under brutal conditions. The situation grew even more dangerous when a series of explosions hit Kiev in late September 1941. These explosions, caused by mines left behind by Soviet forces during their retreat, destroyed German military headquarters and killed several high-ranking officers. Although the Soviets had planted the explosives, the Germans blamed the Jews for the sabotage. This gave them an excuse to launch even more extreme measures against the Jewish population of Kiev. At this point, anti-Semitism in Ukraine had already been inflamed by Nazi propaganda and decades of existing prejudice. Many local Ukrainian nationalists supported the Nazi occupation and took part in the harassment and abuse of Jews. For them, the German takeover was an opportunity to act on their hatred with the full backing of the Nazis. This collaboration between the Germans and local groups only worsened the situation for the Jewish community. The German occupation was harsh on all civilians, not just the Jewish population. Thousands of people were forced into hard labor, property was confiscated, and anyone seen as a threat to the Nazi regime was quickly dealt with. But for the Jews, the danger was even greater. The capture of Kiev had turned their lives upside down, and they lived in constant fear of what was to come. The events that followed the capture of Kiev were devastating. As the Nazis tightened their grip on the city, the Jewish population found itself increasingly isolated and persecuted. The anti-Semitism that had long existed in Ukraine had now been fully unleashed under Nazi rule. Life in Kiev became a nightmare for the Jewish community, as they were stripped of their dignity and treated as less than human. The atmosphere in the city grew darker by the day, with fear and uncertainty gripping everyone under German occupation. The capture of Kiev by the Germans marked the start of a new era of terror for its residents, particularly the Jews. While life for everyone in Kiev became more difficult, the Jewish population knew they were in the greatest danger, trapped under a regime that was determined to destroy them. Chapter 11: The Canyon of Death, the Babin Yar Massacre and the Execution of Kiev's Jews. The Babin Yar Massacre, one of the most horrific events of the Holocaust, took place over 2 days on September 29th and 30th, 1941, just days after Nazi forces captured Kiev. This massacre saw more than 33,000 Jewish men, women and children brutally murdered at Babin Yar, a canyon on the outskirts of the city. The massacre was planned and carried out with precision by the Nazis, aided by local collaborators. The event leading up to the massacre was a series of explosions that destroyed German headquarters in Kiev's city center. These explosions were caused by mines left behind by retreating Soviet forces, but the Nazis blamed the Jewish population for the sabotage. This gave them the justification they needed to move forward with their plan to exterminate the Jews of Kiev. Babin Yar, a deep ravine next to a psychiatric hospital and a prison, was chosen as the site for the massacre. The secluded location made it an ideal place for mass executions, as the ravine would allow for the easy disposal of bodies. Just 24 hours before the massacre began on September 27, 1941, the SS took steps to ensure that no witnesses would remain to tell the tale. A small detachment stormed and evacuated the nearby psychiatric hospital, killing 752 mentally ill patients who could have seen what was about to happen. This was a clear indication of the lengths the Nazis were willing to go to keep their plans hidden. The next day, September 28, 1941, posters were put up around Kiev, ordering all Jews living in the city and surrounding areas to gather at a specific location the following morning. The posters instructed them to bring their documents, money, valuables, and warm clothing. The message warned that any Jew who did not comply would be shot, and that any civilians caught looting the abandoned Jewish properties would face the same punishment. Many of the Jews, terrified but still unsure of what was to come, believed they were being deported to another city or ghetto. On the morning of September 29, 1941, thousands of Jews gathered in the center of Kiev. Many had arrived early, hoping to secure a better place in what they thought would be a deportation. As they waited, the sense of unease grew, but the reality of what was about to happen was far worse than anything they could have imagined. Under heavy guard by Ukrainian police and nationalist militias, the Jews were forced to march toward the outskirts of the city, near the municipal cemetery and Babin Yar. Some began to notice the distant sound of machine guns and the sight of a German airplane circling overhead, which made them even more alarmed. But it was too late to turn back. A checkpoint had been set up at the exit, preventing anyone from leaving. The march to the ravine was filled with horror. Guards insulted the Jews, beat them with clubs, and forced them to keep moving. Once they reached Babin Yar, the true nature of their fate became clear. As they looked down into the ravine, they saw piles of bodies of men, women, and children who had already been executed. What lay before them was death. One by one, the Jews were ordered to leave their belongings by a fence, strip off their clothes, and march to the edge of the ravine. The victims were shot in rounds by members of the Einsatzgruppen with the assistance of local collaborators. The execution process was systematic and brutal. The victims were lined up, gunned down, and their bodies fell into the canyon. In many cases, the victims had been forced to dig their own graves. For the soldiers, this was just routine death work. In just 2 days, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in the Babin Yar massacre. The killing did not stop there. Over the next 2 years, Babin Yar became a mass grave for other groups as well, including Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents. It's estimated that by the end of the Nazi occupation, around 100,000 people had been killed and buried at Babin Yar. In a particularly horrifying detail, some of the victims who were only wounded were buried alive, suffocating under the weight of dirt and the bodies of others. To save ammunition, the Nazis even resorted to covering the wounded with dirt, letting them die a slow and agonizing death. As the Red Army began advancing toward Kiev in 1943, the Nazis realized they needed to cover up their crimes at Babin Yar. To do this, they used prisoners from the Siritz concentration camp located nearby. These prisoners were forced to exhume the bodies, burn them, and scatter the ashes. This gruesome work went on for weeks, and when it was done, the prisoners themselves were executed and thrown into the ravine. Despite the Nazis' efforts to hide their atrocities, some survivors managed to escape and later testified about what they had witnessed. These testimonies were crucial in ensuring that the crimes committed at Babin Yar did not go unpunished. Chapter 12. Justice in Kiev. The trials of the Babin Yar perpetrators. After World War II, justice for the atrocities committed during the Holocaust became a central focus for the Allied powers. The Nuremberg trials are the most well-known of these efforts, but similar trials were conducted in many cities, including Kiev. The trials in Kiev aimed to bring to justice the Nazi officers, collaborators, and local enforcers responsible for crimes like the Babin Yar massacre, where over 33,000 Jews were brutally murdered in just 2 days in September 1941. The trials were part of a larger effort to hold accountable those involved in the Holocaust and other war crimes. Many of the key figures responsible for organizing and executing the Babin Yar massacre were eventually arrested and brought to trial, while others were charged in absentia or managed to avoid justice for years. One of the key figures tried for his role in Babin Yar was Paul Blobel, the overall commander of the SS unit responsible for the massacre. Blobel led Einsatzgruppen C, the mobile killing squad that carried out mass shootings of Jews, communists, and other groups considered undesirable by the Nazi regime. After the war, Blobel was captured and tried during the subsequent Nuremberg trials. In his trial, he was charged with crimes against humanity, including the mass murder of thousands at Babin Yar. The evidence presented against him was overwhelming, including testimonies from survivors and documents detailing his direct involvement. Blobel was sentenced to death and hanged on June 7, 1951 in Landsberg prison. marking a key moment in the quest for justice. Another important figure, Otto Rasch, who was also involved in the Babin Yar massacre as the commander of Einsatzgruppen C, was charged in the same trials. However, Rasch's case was suspended due to health reasons, and he died in prison in 1948 before he could be fully tried. Rasch's death left many questions unanswered, as he was one of the key architects of the mass executions carried out across Eastern Europe. Erich Koch, who had been the Reich Commissar of Ukraine during the Nazi occupation, was also charged with war crimes. Although Koch was not directly involved in Babin Yar, he was responsible for overseeing the brutal policies enforced by the Nazi regime in Ukraine. He was tried by a Polish court for his crimes in Poland, where he was sentenced to death. However, Koch's death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and he died in prison in 1986. Despite his role in the atrocities committed in Ukraine, including those against the Jewish population, Koch was never tried for his crimes in Kiev, leaving a gap in the full scope of justice. The trials in Kiev were not limited to high-ranking Nazi officials. Several lower-ranking officers, particularly members of the German police who were involved in carrying out the atrocities, were also brought to trial. In January 1946, 15 former members of the German police stood trial in Kiev for their involvement in the Babin Yar massacre and other war crimes committed during the Nazi occupation. Of these 15 men, 12 were sentenced to death and publicly hanged in Kiev's city square on January 29, 1946. The public nature of the executions was intended to serve as a reminder to the people of Kiev and the world that justice was being served for the horrors of the war. While these trials were about punishing the perpetrators, they also served the purpose of documenting the atrocities and preserving the memories of those who had suffered. Survivors like Dina Pronicheva played a major role in ensuring that the crimes did not go unpunished. Pronicheva, a Jewish survivor of the Babin Yar massacre, gave a chilling testimony during the trials, recounting what she had witnessed. In one of her written testimonies, she described the terror of seeing group after group of people, including men, women, and children, being forced to undress and shot at the edge of the ravine. Pronicheva's testimony was particularly powerful because she had survived the massacre in a way that seemed almost impossible. After being buried alive, she managed to crawl out of the mass grave under cover of darkness, escaping while the Nazis continued to execute others. Her survival was a miracle. The evidence presented at the Kiev trials was overwhelming. Testimonies from survivors, documents recovered from the Nazi regime, and the accounts of witnesses all pointed to the same conclusion. The men on trial had committed unspeakable crimes. The trials were thorough, and the Soviet court system made sure that the world knew what had happened at Babin Yar and other sites of mass murder. Despite these trials, many of the key perpetrators of the Babin Yar massacre and other atrocities in Kiev never faced justice. The vast majority of those responsible for the mass killings, particularly young Nazis and local collaborators, were never tried for their roles in the Holocaust. Some managed to escape justice by fleeing to other countries, while others retreated back into society. Even with the trials and the executions, there remained a sense that true justice had not been fully served for all the victims.